The October wind carried the scent of decay and wet earth through Oakwood Cemetery as Isabella Marquez pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. 12 years had passed since she last stood before this granite headstone. 12 years since she fled Chicago and the memories that haunted every street corner. But today marked the anniversary of her father's death, and guilt had finally pulled her back to the city she once called home. Detective Javier Marquez's grave sat beneath an ancient oak tree, its branches now bare and reaching toward the overcast sky like skeletal fingers. Isabella knelt on the damp grass, her fingers trembling as she traced the carved letters of his name. The wound in her heart, which time had supposedly healed, ripped open fresh and raw. She had brought yellow roses, his favorites, clutched in her left hand. But as she reached forward to place them against the headstone, she froze. There, already resting against the cold granite, lay a pristine bouquet of white lilies tied with black ribbon. The flowers were fresh, their petals still dotted with morning dew, impossibly perfect against the gray morning. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Who would leave flowers here? Her father had been a solitary man, devoted to his work, with few friends, and even fewer who would remember him after all these years. Her mother had passed when Isabella was just a child, and there were no other relatives who cared enough to visit. With shaking hands, she reached for the bouquet. That's when she saw it. A small card tucked between the stems, sealed in plastic to protect it from the elements. The handwriting was elegant, almost aristocratic, written in black ink that seemed to absorb the light around it. From the Mafia boss who owed him a life. The words blurred as tears filled Isabella's eyes. Her mind reeled, struggling to process what she was reading. A Mafia boss? Her father had been the most honest cop Chicago had ever seen. The one man who couldn't be bought, threatened, or corrupted. He had dedicated his life to fighting organized crime, to bringing down the very men who now claimed to owe him something. Isabella sank back onto her heels, the yellow roses falling forgotten to the ground. Memories she had tried to bury came flooding back with devastating clarity. The night her father died, she had been 23, finishing her graduate degree in literature at Northwestern University. She remembered the phone call that came at 2 a.m, the way the detective's voice on the other end had broken, as he told her they found Javier's body on a deserted road outside the city, 3 bullets in his chest. The investigation had gone nowhere. The case was labeled a robbery gone wrong, despite the fact that her father's wallet, badge, and weapon were all still on his body. Isabella had screamed at the detectives, demanding they dig deeper, insisting that her father had enemies who wanted him dead. But the case went cold within weeks, filed away and forgotten like so many others. Now, staring at this cryptic message, Isabella felt something ignite inside her that had been dormant for over a decade. Rage, confusion, and most dangerously, hope. Hope that maybe, finally, she could find the truth about what really happened that night. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and photographed the card, the flowers, everything. Then she carefully rewrapped the lilies and set them back against the headstone alongside her roses. The juxtaposition was jarring. Innocent yellow beside funeral white, both resting on a grave that had more secrets than answers. "Who were you, Dad?" she whispered to the cold stone. "What did you do that a Mafia boss thinks he owes you?" The wind picked up, scattering dead leaves across the cemetery paths. Isabella stood, brushing dirt from her knees, her mind already racing through possibilities. She was a literature professor now, living a quiet life, analyzing fictional mysteries and tragedies. But this was real. This was her father. And every instinct told her that this bouquet, this message, was the key to unlocking a truth that had been buried alongside Javier Marquez 12 years ago. As she walked back toward her car, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't leaving Chicago until she found out who left those flowers and why they claimed to owe her father a debt. even if it meant confronting the darkest corners of the city's underworld. Even if it meant discovering things about her father she might not want to know. The Mafia boss who left this message had made a mistake. He had given her a thread to pull, and Isabella Marquez was going to unravel the entire tapestry, no matter what monsters she found hiding in its weave. Isabella spent the next 3 days in a hotel room that smelled of stale cigarettes and broken dreams, surrounded by papers, photographs, and her father's old case files that she had kept in a storage unit for over a decade. She had called in sick to the university, lying about a family emergency. In truth, this was the most important work she had ever done. The files painted a picture of a man she thought she knew, but perhaps never truly understood. Detective Javier Marquez had been relentless, incorruptible, and completely alone in his crusade against Chicago's organized crime families. His notes were meticulous, detailing connections between corrupt politicians, dirty cops, and the 3 major crime syndicates that controlled the city's underground economy. One name appeared more frequently than any other: Vincenzo De Luca. Isabella's fingers trembled as she spread out a series of photographs taken during surveillance operations her father had conducted. Vincenzo De Luca wasn't just any crime boss. He was the king of Chicago's underworld, the man who controlled everything from the docks to the gambling dens, from protection rackets to high-end drug distribution. Even 12 years ago, his empire had been vast and seemingly untouchable. But what struck Isabella most was that her father's notes about De Luca were different from the others. Where other criminals were described with clinical detachment or obvious contempt, the entries about Vincenzo contained something else, a strange kind of respect, perhaps even admiration. There were notations about De Luca's code of honor, his refusal to deal in human trafficking, his protection of innocent civilians caught in crossfire. "He's a monster with rules," her father had written in the margins of one report. "The most dangerous kind because people love him for it." Isabella's research led her to newspaper archives, where she discovered that Vincenzo De Luca, now in his late 60s, was a legend in Chicago. He had survived assassination attempts, federal investigations, and gang wars that had claimed the lives of dozens of his rivals. But he had also, according to local lore, funded community centers, paid for funerals of innocent bystanders killed in mob violence, and once personally executed one of his own lieutenants for attacking a woman. The more she read, the more confused she became. This was the man who claimed to owe her father a life? What possible connection could exist between an honest detective and Chicago's most notorious crime lord? On the 4th day, Isabella made a decision that terrified her. She would confront Vincenzo De Luca directly. She would walk into the lion's den and demand answers. It was reckless, possibly suicidal, but she had come too far to turn back now. Finding him wasn't difficult. De Luca's legitimate businesses were listed publicly: restaurants, construction companies, waste management firms. His flagship establishment was a high-end Italian restaurant in the Gold Coast neighborhood called Bella Notte, where Chicago's elite mingled with the city's shadows, pretending not to know who really owned the place. Isabella called ahead, asking for a reservation under her real name. She wanted him to know she was coming. She wanted him to wonder why. That evening, she dressed carefully in a black dress and heels, her father's detective badge tucked in her purse like a talisman. As she drove toward the restaurant, her hands were steady on the wheel, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Bella Notte occupied a corner building with red brick and warm lighting spilling from tall windows. A valet took her car, and a hostess with knowing eyes led her inside without asking her name. The interior was elegant: dark wood, white tablecloths, the soft murmur of conversation and clinking glasses. Classical Italian opera played softly in the background. "Miss Marquez," the hostess said, stopping before a private booth in the back corner. "Mr. De Luca is expecting you." Isabella's breath caught. The man sitting in the booth was not what she expected. Vincenzo De Luca was in his late 60s, his dark hair silvered at the temples and slicked back in an impeccable style. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt with the top button casually undone, revealing a glimpse of ink on his chest. Some kind of religious iconography, she thought. A gold Rolex gleamed on his wrist, and a heavy signet ring adorned his right hand. But what struck her most were his eyes. They were dark, intelligent, and profoundly sad. This was a man who had seen too much, done too much, and carried the weight of it all in the lines etched deep into his distinguished face. "Miss Marquez," he said, his voice gravelly but cultured, with just a hint of an Italian accent. "Please sit. I've been expecting you since the moment you found my flowers." Isabella slid into the booth across from him, forcing herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "You knew I would come." "Your father's daughter? Of course you would come." He gestured to a waiter who appeared instantly with wine. "You have his eyes. The same fire, the same unwillingness to let things rest. Then you knew my father." It wasn't a question. Vincenzo's expression softened, and for a moment, Isabella saw genuine grief cross his features. "I knew Detective Javier Marquez, yes, and I owe him more than flowers can ever repay." "The note said you owed him a life. What does that mean?" Vincenzo lifted his wineglass, studying the dark liquid before taking a slow sip. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, meant only for her. "It means your father saved my daughter when no one else could. It means he risked everything he believed in to do what was right. And it means I tried to save him in return, but I was too late. That is a debt I will carry until my last breath." Isabella felt the world tilt beneath her. "Your daughter? My father saved your daughter? Would you like to hear the story, Miss Marquez? The real story of what happened 12 years ago? Because I promise you, it's not what you think. Nothing about your father's death was what anyone told you." Isabella's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Tell me everything." And so, in a restaurant filled with secrets and lies, Chicago's most powerful crime lord began to tell her the truth about the night her father died, and the twisted path that had led them all to this moment. Vincenzo De Luca leaned back in the booth, his eyes distant as he reached into the past. The restaurant buzzed with life around them, but in their corner, time seemed to slow, the air heavy with secrets about to be unearthed. 15 years ago, he began, his voice low and measured, I had everything a man in my position could want. Power, respect, wealth. But none of it mattered compared to my daughter, Sophia. She was 17, brilliant, kind, everything good that I was not. She was the one pure thing in my corrupted world, and I protected her fiercely, kept her away from the business, sent her to the best private schools. He paused to sip his wine, and Isabella saw his hand tremble slightly. But my enemies knew that to hurt me, they had to hurt her. Antonio Russo, a rival who wanted my territory. He planned something that violated every code we lived by. He arranged for Sophia to be kidnapped on her way home from school. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. She had read about this case in her father's files, but the details had been sparse, classified. They took her in broad daylight, Vincenzo continued, his voice thick with remembered pain. 3 men, professional, brutal. They held her for 4 days in a warehouse on the south side. 4 days where I didn't know if she was alive or dead. 4 days where I prepared to burn this entire city to the ground if they harmed one hair on her head. The police were involved in the investigation, Isabella said quietly. My father was assigned to the case. Your father was the lead detective, yes, but here's what you don't know. Most of the Chicago PD at that time was on someone's payroll. Mine, Russo's, or the Colombians'. The detectives assigned to find Sophia were deliberately running the investigation in circles, giving Russo time to make his demands, to humiliate me before eventually killing her anyway. Vincenzo's jaw clenched, and Isabella could see the rage that still lived in him after all these years. Everyone except Javier Marquez. Your father took one look at that case and knew something was wrong. He saw the delays, the misdirections, the false leads. And he did what no other cop in Chicago would dare to do. He came to me directly. Isabella's eyes widened. He came to you? He walked into my office, this restaurant actually, sat right where you're sitting now, and he said, I know your daughter is still alive. I know cops on my force are involved in this, and I'm going to find her. But I need your word that when I do, you won't start a war that will kill innocent people. Vincenzo's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He was risking his career, possibly his life, to make that deal with me, because he believed saving a 17-year-old girl was more important than the rulebook. What happened? Isabella whispered, though part of her already knew this story would break her heart. Your father worked around the clock, following leads the other detectives ignored. He traced phone records, interviewed witnesses they had dismissed, and on the fourth day, he found the warehouse. He called for backup, but by the time they arrived, he had already gone in alone because he knew Sophia was running out of time. Vincenzo's voice cracked. He killed 2 of her captors in the firefight and wounded the 3rd. When I arrived with my men, because yes, he called me too, kept his word about preventing a war. He was carrying Sophia out of that burning building. She was traumatized, dehydrated, but alive. Because of him. Isabella felt tears streaming down her face. This was the father she knew. The man who would risk everything for what was right, who saw a girl in danger and couldn't look away, even if saving her meant crossing lines that could destroy him. I tried to thank him, Vincenzo said. I tried to offer him money, protection, anything. He refused it all. He said he was just doing his job. But I saw the looks from the other cops when they arrived. I saw the hatred in their eyes because Javier Marquez had exposed their corruption, had shown them for what they were, and I knew they would make him pay. The other detectives, Isabella breathed. They killed him. Vincenzo nodded slowly. 3 years later, your father had gathered evidence against a network of dirty cops, men who were taking bribes, protecting criminals, even participating in crimes themselves. He was about to take that evidence to the FBI. But someone warned them. Someone told them Javier was about to bring down their entire operation. The crime boss's hands clenched into fists on the table. They set up a meeting, told him they had information on a case. They lured him to that deserted road. And they executed him like he was nothing more than a problem to be eliminated. Isabella's world spun. All these years she had wondered, had suspected, but hearing it confirmed was like being shot herself. You knew who killed him. I found out 2 days after he died. My sources in the department told me everything. And I swear to you, Miss Marquez, I tried to save him. When I heard about the setup, I sent my men to intercept, to warn him. But we were 15 minutes too late. By the time we arrived, he was already gone. Vincenzo's voice broke completely. I failed him. The man who saved my daughter, who showed me that honor could exist outside my world, who trusted me with his life. I failed him when he needed me most. That is the debt I owe. That is why I bring flowers to his grave every year. It's the only way I can tell him I'm sorry. The restaurant around them continued its elegant dance of dinner and conversation, oblivious to the storm of revelation happening in the corner booth. Isabella sat frozen, her mind trying to process everything she had just learned. Her father hadn't just been murdered. He had been betrayed by the very institution he served, killed by the men who were supposed to be his brothers in blue. And the most feared crime lord in Chicago had been the only one who tried to save him. Who were they? Isabella asked, her voice cold and sharp as a knife. Give me their names. Vincenzo studied her face, seeing the same determination that her father had possessed. If I tell you, What will you do with that information? These men are still protected, still powerful. Going after them could get you killed just like your father. I don't care, Isabella said fiercely. My father spent his life fighting for justice. If I walk away now, if I let his killers continue to live free and unpunished, then he died for nothing. His sacrifice meant nothing. Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it across the table. Your father gave this to me 3 days before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should keep it safe. Inside are copies of every piece of evidence he gathered: bank records, photographs, recorded conversations, witness statements. Everything needed to destroy the men who killed him. Isabella's hands shook as she picked up the envelope. Why didn't you use this yourself? Why didn't you destroy them? Because I'm a criminal, Miss Marquez. Anything I did would be dismissed as mob retaliation. But you're his daughter, a respected professor, someone with no ties to organized crime. If you take this to the right people, they'll have to listen. The truth will have to come out. He leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. But understand this. The moment you open that envelope, the moment you start this fight, those men will come for you. They've had 12 years to entrench themselves deeper into the system. They're desperate, and desperate men are the most dangerous kind. Isabella met his gaze without fear. Then I'll need protection. You said you owed my father a debt. Help me finish what he started. Help me bring his killers to justice. A slow smile crossed Vincenzo De Luca's weathered face. You are definitely Javier's daughter. Yes, Miss Marquez. You'll have my protection, my resources, everything I can provide. Those men took away the only cop in Chicago who ever showed me that honor exists outside our world. They'll pay for that. I swear on my daughter's life. They'll pay. As Isabella left the restaurant that night, the envelope clutched to her chest. She felt her father's presence more strongly than she had in years. The war was just beginning, but for the first time since his death, she felt like she could finally fight back, and she wouldn't be fighting alone. The next morning, Isabella sat in her hotel room with the contents of the envelope spread across the bed like pieces of a devastating puzzle. She had stayed awake all night, reading through every document, studying every photograph, listening to the scratchy recordings on the old cassette tapes her father had somehow preserved. What she discovered made her physically ill. The corruption ran deeper than she could have imagined. Detective Marcus Brennan, Lieutenant Frank Costello, and Sergeant David Morrison. 3 names that appeared again and again in her father's meticulous notes. These weren't just dirty cops taking small bribes. They were running a criminal enterprise within the police department itself, using their badges as cover for extortion, drug trafficking, and murder. Her father's notes detailed everything. Bank accounts in offshore havens showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in deposits. Photographs of the 3 men meeting with known drug dealers in abandoned warehouses. Recorded phone conversations where they casually discussed eliminating witnesses and splitting profits. And most damning of all, a timeline showing that they had learned about her father's investigation and began planning his murder 3 weeks before it happened. Isabella's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Car downstairs. Driver named Marco. Vincenzo wants you somewhere safe while you work. D. She gathered the documents carefully, placing them back in the envelope, then packed her few belongings. Downstairs, a black Mercedes with tinted windows waited at the curb. The driver, a man in his 40s with careful eyes and a slight bulge under his jacket that indicated a shoulder holster, opened the rear door for her. Miss Marquez, Mr. De Luca has arranged a secure location for you. Somewhere those 3 bastards won't think to look. The drive took them out of the downtown area to a quiet neighborhood of renovated brownstones in Lincoln Park. Marco led her to a 4th-floor apartment with a view of the park below. The space was elegant but functional. 2 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and most importantly, a large dining table where she could work. "There's a panic button installed next to the front door," Marco explained. "Press it, and you'll have 5 armed men here in under 3 minutes. I'll be in the car outside 24/7, rotating with 2 other guys. Nobody gets up here without us knowing about it." Over the next week, Isabella worked with an intensity she had never experienced before. She organized the evidence into a comprehensive timeline, cross-referenced everything, and built an airtight case that no prosecutor could ignore. But she also realized that simply having evidence wasn't enough. She needed a way to make it public, to create so much noise that the corruption couldn't be buried again. That's when she decided to reach out to Rachel Chen, an investigative journalist with the Chicago Tribune known for taking down powerful people. Isabella had followed Rachel's work for years, admiring her fearlessness and integrity. If anyone could help expose this story, it was her. They met in a coffee shop in Wicker Park, far from police headquarters, or anywhere the dirty cops might have surveillance. Rachel was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed and skeptical. But when Isabella began laying out the evidence, her expression shifted from doubt to absolute focus. "Jesus Christ," Rachel whispered, looking at the photographs and documents spread subtly between them. "This is Pulitzer-level stuff. But you understand what you're asking me to do? These men have connections everywhere. They've survived this long by being careful and ruthless. My father was careful too," Isabella said quietly. "And they murdered him anyway. I'm not asking you to do this for me. I'm asking you to do it for every person in Chicago who believes cops should actually protect them instead of preying on them." Rachel studied her for a long moment. "You have protection? Because the minute I start digging, they'll know someone's coming for them. I have protection from someone they fear more than the police department." Rachel's eyebrows rose. "Vincenzo De Luca, I heard rumors you'd been seen at Bellanotte. Most people would call that trading one devil for another. Most people don't know that De Luca tried to save my father. Most people don't know my father saved his daughter. Sometimes the world isn't as black and white as we want it to be." "No," Rachel agreed, carefully photographing documents with her phone. "Sometimes it's all shades of complicated gray." "All right, I'm in. But we do this right. I need to verify everything independently, find additional sources, build a case so strong that even their connections can't make it disappear." For the next 3 weeks, Isabella and Rachel worked in parallel. Rachel conducted interviews, found retired cops willing to talk anonymously, and tracked down criminals who had paid bribes to the 3 corrupt detectives. Meanwhile, Isabella used Vincenzo's resources to uncover even more evidence: surveillance footage from businesses near meeting locations, financial records that Rachel couldn't access legally, witness testimony from people too afraid to talk to a journalist, but willing to speak to someone with De Luca's protection. But as their investigation progressed, the pressure increased. Isabella started noticing the same cars following her when Marco drove her around the city. Her hotel room, she still kept her original reservation as a decoy, was broken into, though nothing was taken. And Rachel received an anonymous phone call, warning her to leave sleeping dogs alone or join them in their sleep. "They know," Isabella told Vincenzo during one of their weekly meetings at Bellanotte. "They're getting desperate." Vincenzo nodded gravely. "Desperate men make mistakes, but they also become more dangerous. I've increased your security detail. Marco now has 4 men rotating, and I've put word out in the streets. Anyone who touches you or the journalist answers to me personally. That should buy you some protection." "What about when we go public? When Rachel's story runs?" "When that happens," Vincenzo said, his expression dark, "all bets are off. They'll know they're finished, and finished men have nothing to lose. You need to be somewhere they can't reach you when that story drops." The confrontation came sooner than expected. Isabella was leaving the Tribune offices after a late night working with Rachel when a car pulled up beside her on the street. Detective Marcus Brennan stepped out, his face twisted with barely controlled rage. "Miss Marquez, we need to talk." Marco was immediately between them, hand inside his jacket. Two more of Vincenzo's men materialized from the shadows, bracketing Isabella protectively. Brennan laughed bitterly. "So, it's true. Javier's little girl is sleeping with the enemy. Your father would be ashamed." "My father would be ashamed of you," Isabella shot back, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He trusted you. He called you his brother. And you put 3 bullets in his chest because he wouldn't let you destroy everything he believed in." Brennan's face went pale, then red. "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand how the real world works. I understand that you're a murderer. I understand that you've been stealing from this city for years. And I understand that in 72 hours, everyone else is going to understand it too." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." Rachel Chen is running her story in the Sunday edition. Front page, full expose, every piece of evidence my father gathered plus everything we've found since. Your face, Costello's face, Morrison's face, all of them plastered across the news for everyone to see. Your careers are over, your freedom is over, and my father can finally rest. Brennan took a step forward, but Marco's hand emerged from his jacket holding a gun, held low but unmistakably ready. The detective froze. "You think you've won?" Brennan hissed. "You think we don't have protections in place? We've survived worse than some college professor and a wannabe journalist. This isn't over." "You're right," Isabella said coldly. "It's not over. Not until you're in a cell for the rest of your life. Now get away from me before I have Mr. DeLuca's men escort you there ahead of schedule." Brennan stared at her for a long moment, then spat on the sidewalk before returning to his car. As it drove away, Isabella realized her hands were shaking. "You did good," Marco said quietly. But he meant what he said. "They're going to come at you hard now. We need to move you tonight." Isabella nodded. The battle lines were drawn. In 72 hours, the truth would explode across Chicago. And whatever happened after that, there was no turning back. The war for her father's justice had truly begun. The safe house Vincenzo arranged was a penthouse apartment in a high-rise building he owned through a shell corporation. The top floor had only 2 units, and he had bought both, meaning Isabella had an entire floor to herself with security stationed at the elevator and stairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago's glittering skyline, but Isabella barely noticed. She was too focused on the countdown. 72 hours until Rachel's story went live. 72 hours until she destroyed the men who killed her father. But those 72 hours felt like an eternity. On the first night, Isabella couldn't sleep. She stood at the windows watching the city lights blur through her tears, thinking about her father. She remembered him teaching her to ride a bike, remembered him reading to her before bed, remembered the way he always wore his badge with such pride. He had believed in justice, in the system, in the idea that good people could make a difference. And that belief had gotten him killed. Her phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number that she now knew belonged to one of Vincenzo's people. "They hit Rachel Chen's apartment tonight. She wasn't there. We had her moved to a hotel under a false name. They're panicking." Isabella's jaw clenched. So it was starting. Brennan, Costello, and Morrison were making their moves, trying to silence anyone who threatened them. But they were too late. The story was already written, already edited, already scheduled to run. Rachel had copies stored in multiple locations, as did her editor. The Tribune's lawyers had reviewed every word. There was no stopping what was coming. The second day brought more pressure. Isabella's university received an anonymous tip claiming she was involved in academic fraud. Her bank accounts were frozen pending an investigation into suspicious transactions. Someone posted her address online along with false accusations that she was under investigation for embezzling grant money. "They're trying to destroy your credibility before the story drops," Vincenzo explained when he visited that evening. He looked tired, older somehow, but his eyes still held that fierce intensity. They want people to doubt you when you're inevitably mentioned as a source. Will it work? Isabella asked. No. The evidence is too strong. And it's not just from you. Rachel has multiple independent sources, but it shows how desperate they are, which makes them dangerous. That night, Morrison's younger brother, who worked as a private investigator, was found dead in his apartment. Suicide, the initial report said, though Vincenzo's sources whispered it was murder made to look like suicide. The message was clear. Anyone associated with the corrupt cops was being eliminated to prevent them from turning witness. They're cleaning house, Marco told Isabella, getting rid of anyone who might testify against them. Your father's evidence is the only record that can't be silenced. On the third day, 48 hours before publication, Isabella received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. Against Marco's advice, she answered it. Miss Marquez? The voice was older, refined. My name is Chief Harold Davidson. I'm the current Chicago Chief of Police. Isabella's heart hammered. How did you get this number? Please, don't hang up. I'm calling because I need you to understand something. The accusations you're making against Detectives Brennan, Costello, and Morrison, they're going to tear this department apart. Good cops, innocent people, are going to be painted with the same brush. The public trust in law enforcement is already fragile. This could destroy it completely. My father trusted law enforcement, Isabella said coldly, and it destroyed him. Those good cops you're worried about? They looked the other way for years while Brennan and his crew ran their empire. They're complicit. I'm not asking you to drop the story. I'm asking you to give me time to handle this internally. Let me investigate. Let me build cases through proper channels. Let me preserve what's good about this department while rooting out what's rotten. Internal investigation. Isabella laughed bitterly. Like the one that concluded my father was killed in a random robbery. Like the investigation that cleared everyone of wrongdoing. Chief Davidson, with all due respect, the Chicago PD has had 12 years to handle this internally. You failed. Now it's being handled externally. There was a long silence. I can't protect you from what's coming, Miss Marquez. Once that story runs, there will be people in this city, people with power and connections, who will want to silence you permanently, and I can't guarantee your safety. I'm not asking you to. I have my own protection. From Vincenzo De Luca, yes, I'm aware. Do you understand what you've done? You've allied yourself with the very criminals your father spent his life fighting. You've legitimized him, given him respectability he doesn't deserve. That's your father's real legacy now. His daughter in bed with the mob. Isabella's voice went ice cold. Vincenzo De Luca tried to save my father's life. Your detectives took it. If you want to talk about betrayal, Chief, look in the mirror. This conversation is over. She hung up, her hands shaking with rage. Marco appeared in the doorway, concern etched on his face. That was a warning, he said quietly. They're going to come at you from every angle now. Legal, professional, personal. And when that doesn't work, they'll try to kill me. I know. Isabella met his eyes steadily. I'm not backing down, Marco. Not after coming this far. Mr. De Luca figured you'd say that. He's called in reinforcements. Starting tonight, you've got 8 men on rotation instead of 4. And he's reaching out to contacts in the FBI, people who owe him favors, to make sure they're ready to move the minute the story breaks. He's not letting what happened to your father happen to you. That evening, as the sun set over Chicago painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Isabella stood at the windows again. Somewhere out there, Brennan, Costello, and Morrison were probably having similar conversations, making their own desperate plans. They knew the hammer was about to fall, knew their world was ending. But unlike her father, she wasn't facing them alone. She had Rachel's relentless journalism. She had evidence that couldn't be denied. And yes, She had the protection of Chicago's most feared crime lord, a man who understood better than anyone that sometimes justice exists outside the system that's supposed to provide it. Her phone buzzed one more time. A message from Rachel. "Story is locked. Sunday morning, front page. We did it. Your father would be proud." Isabella read the message through tears. Tomorrow was Saturday, the day before publication. One more day to survive. One more day until the truth exploded across Chicago, and her father's killers were finally exposed. She thought about the flowers on her father's grave, those pristine white lilies left by a man who most of the world considered a monster. She thought about how her father had crossed lines to save Vincenzo's daughter, how he had risked everything because it was right, regardless of the rules. Maybe the world wasn't divided neatly into good and evil. Maybe sometimes honor existed in unexpected places. Maybe sometimes justice required strange alliances. "I'm going to finish this, Dad," she whispered to the darkening sky. "I'm going to finish what you started. I promise." Below, the city lights began to flicker to life, thousands upon thousands of them, like stars reflected on Earth. And somewhere in that vast constellation of light and shadow, the final pieces of this long, painful puzzle were falling into place. The storm was coming, and Isabella Marquez intended to be standing in its eye when it finally broke. Sunday morning arrived with snow flurries, unusual for October but fitting for what was about to unfold. Isabella woke before dawn, unable to sleep, and made coffee with shaking hands. By 6 a.m., the first copies of the Chicago Tribune were hitting newsstands across the city. The headline stretched across the entire front page in bold black letters. "Murder in Blue. How 3 detectives executed one of their own and built a criminal empire inside CPD." Below it, photographs of Brennan, Costello, and Morrison, alongside an image of her father in his dress uniform. The story continued for 6 full pages inside, laying out 12 years of corruption in devastating detail. Rachel had done her job perfectly. Every fact verified, every source protected, every piece of evidence presented with surgical precision. By 7 a.m., Isabella's phone was exploding with calls from news networks, other journalists, and lawyers. By 8, crowds had gathered outside police headquarters demanding answers. By 9, the FBI announced they were launching an immediate investigation. And by 10 a.m., all 3 detectives had been arrested. Isabella watched it all unfold on the television in the penthouse, Marco standing guard by the door. News helicopters circled police headquarters as Brennan, Costello, and Morrison were led out in handcuffs, their heads down, shielding their faces from the cameras. She felt no triumph, only a profound sadness that it had taken 12 years and her father's death to reach this moment. Her phone rang. Rachel Chen, her voice thick with exhaustion and emotion. "We did it. The DA just announced they're charging all 3 with first-degree murder, corruption, racketeering, and about 20 other charges. Internal Affairs is opening investigations into 47 other cops who were mentioned in the evidence. Isabella, we actually did it." "My father did it," Isabella corrected softly. "We just finished what he started." The next few weeks were a blur. Isabella gave testimony to federal prosecutors, sat for interviews with the FBI, and watched as the case against her father's killers grew stronger every day. More witnesses came forward, emboldened by the arrests. Other dirty cops scrambled to cut deals, offering information in exchange for lighter sentences. The Chicago Police Department was being torn apart and rebuilt, just as Chief Davidson had predicted. But through it all, Isabella found herself thinking about Vincenzo De Luca, the man who had protected her, who had kept her father's evidence safe for 12 years, who had honored a debt that most people would have forgotten. She needed to see him again, needed to properly thank him. She found him at Bella Notte one evening in late November. He looked frailer than before, moving slowly as he stood to greet her. The restaurant was quieter than usual, perhaps because the newspapers had reported his connection to the case, and Chicago's elite were temporarily keeping their distance. "Miss Marquez," he said, gesturing to the booth. "I've been following the news. Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished." "I couldn't have done it without you," Isabella said, sitting across from him. "You kept the evidence safe. You protected me. You helped bring justice when the system failed." Vincenzo smiled sadly. Justice. An interesting word from a professor to a crime lord, but I'll accept it. Your father showed me that honor can exist anywhere, in anyone, even in me, perhaps. Keeping his evidence, protecting his daughter, it was the least I could do. "Why?" Isabella asked. "You could have destroyed those documents. You could have let sleeping dogs lie. Why risk drawing attention to yourself?" "Because Javier Marquez saved my daughter's life," Vincenzo said simply. "Because he treated me like a man worth making a deal with, not just a monster to be destroyed. Because he showed me that even people like us can do the right thing sometimes. How could I betray that?" They talked for hours that evening, sharing memories of her father, discussing the ongoing trials, and slowly building an unlikely friendship. Vincenzo told her about Sofia, now a successful doctor in Boston, married with 2 children, living a life completely separate from her father's world. Isabella told him about her plans to write a book about her father's case, to ensure his story was never forgotten. "Will you write about me in this book?" Vincenzo asked. "Would you want me to?" "I want you to tell the truth," he said. "All of it. The good and the bad. Let people know that Javier Marquez was so committed to justice that he made a deal with the devil to save an innocent girl. Let them know that even the devil kept his word." 3 months later, at the trial, all 3 former detectives were found guilty on all counts. Brennan and Costello received life sentences without parole. Morrison, who testified against the others in exchange for a lighter sentence, got 30 years. The courtroom erupted in applause when the verdict was read, but Isabella just closed her eyes and let the tears fall. It was over. Finally, truly over. That spring, Isabella returned to teaching, though she never quite fit back into her old life. She had seen too much, changed too much. She began work on her book, spending weekends in Chicago conducting interviews and piecing together the full story of her father's life and death. And every October, on the anniversary of his death, she returned to Oakwood Cemetery with yellow roses. But she was never alone. White lilies were always there waiting, placed carefully against the headstone, with no note needed anymore. Sometimes she arrived early enough to see an elderly man in an expensive coat leaving, his movements slow but dignified, a young man in a dark suit helping him walk. Vincenzo never acknowledged her presence, and she never approached him. This was his time to pay his respects, to honor the debt he felt he could never fully repay. It was a ritual that would continue until one of them could no longer make the journey. One year, Isabella didn't see Vincenzo at the cemetery. She learned a few days later from the news that he had passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his daughter and grandchildren. At his funeral, hundreds gathered, criminals and legitimate businessmen, old rivals and family members, all paying their respects to Chicago's last true godfather. Isabella attended, standing in the back, unnoticed by most. When the ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed, she approached the grave. Sofia De Luca was there, a handsome woman in her 40s with her father's dark eyes. "You're Isabella Marquez," Sofia said softly. "My father talked about you often in his last months, about your father too. He said Javier Marquez was the best man he ever knew, and that you inherited his courage." "Your father kept his word to mine," Isabella replied. "He protected me when no one else could. He helped bring justice when the system failed. I owed him a debt too." Sofia smiled through tears. He would have appreciated hearing that. All his life, people feared him, used him, or condemned him. But your father, And you. You saw past what he was to who he could be. That meant everything to him. Isabella reached into her bag and pulled out a bouquet of white lilies, the same kind Vincenzo had left on her father's grave for so many years. She placed them carefully beside the fresh earth. "From the detective who believed in honor," she whispered, "and from the daughter who now believes in forgiveness." As she walked away from the cemetery that day, Isabella felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of rage and grief that had pressed on her chest for so long had finally lifted. She had given her father justice. She had learned that honor could exist in the most unexpected places. And she had discovered that sometimes the monsters we're taught to fear are capable of more humanity than the heroes we're taught to trust. The world, she understood now, was neither black nor white, neither wholly good nor wholly evil. It was a tapestry of gray, woven with threads of choice and consequence, where people like her father and Vincenzo De Luca could exist in the same story, each flawed and complicated, each trying in their own way to pay the debts they owed. Isabella returned to her life, to her teaching and her writing. But she never forgot the lesson those white lilies taught her, that sometimes the greatest honor comes from the most unlikely sources, and that redemption is possible even for those who live in shadow, as long as they're willing to step into the light when it matters most. Years later, when her book was published, she dedicated it to two men. To Detective Javier Marquez, who showed me the meaning of justice, and to Vincenzo De Luca, who showed me the meaning of honor. May we all have the courage to see beyond what we expect, and recognize truth wherever it lives. And every October, without fail, fresh white lilies appeared on Javier Marquez's grave, placed there by Sofia De Luca, continuing her father's promise, ensuring that the debt of honor would be paid long after both men had passed from this world. In the end, that was the real story. Not of cops and criminals, not of good and evil, but of two men who found respect across an impossible divide, whose choices created ripples that changed the lives of everyone they touched, and of two daughters who honored their father's legacies by refusing to let their stories be forgotten. Justice had been served, honor had been kept. And in a cemetery in Chicago, beneath an old oak tree, two bouquets of flowers, yellow and white, rested together on a detective's grave, a testament to the complicated, beautiful, tragic truth that sometimes the most unlikely people can change the world simply by keeping their promises. 6 months had passed since the verdict, and spring had arrived in Chicago with an insistence that felt almost aggressive after the brutal winter. Isabella stood in her new office at Northwestern University, surrounded by boxes of research materials for her book. The university had offered her a position as a visiting professor, specializing in criminal justice narratives, a role that felt like destiny rather than coincidence. The view from her window overlooked the campus quad, where students hurried between classes, their faces bright with the oblivious optimism of youth. Isabella envied them that lightness. She had once been like that, believing the world operated according to clear moral lines, that justice was a given rather than something you had to fight and bleed for. Her phone buzzed, a text from Rachel Chen. "Published numbers are in. Your book pre-orders just hit the NYT bestseller list. You're going to change how people think about corruption and redemption. Drinks tonight to celebrate?" Isabella smiled faintly, but didn't respond immediately. The book, Flowers for the Dead, A Daughter's Search for Justice, wasn't due for release for another month, but the advance publicity had been overwhelming. Every major news outlet wanted interviews. Documentary producers were calling. Hollywood agents were circling with offers to adapt the story. But what struck Isabella most were the letters. Hundreds of them, from people across the country who had lost loved ones to police violence, to corruption, to a justice system that protected its own. They wrote to thank her, to tell their own stories, to ask for advice on how to fight back when fighting back seemed impossible. She had become, quite accidentally, a symbol, and the weight of that was heavier than any grief she had carried for her father. A knock on her office door pulled her from her thoughts. Marco stood in the hallway, no longer in the black suit and earpiece of a bodyguard, but dressed casually in jeans and a leather jacket. Vincenzo's organization had largely disbanded after his death, with Sofia ensuring that her father's legitimate businesses stayed legitimate, and his criminal enterprises were quietly shut down or sold to rivals with strict stipulations about avoiding violence and human trafficking. Marco had taken a job as head of security for a downtown hotel, but he still checked on Isabella regularly. The bond formed during those dangerous weeks had never quite faded. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, handing her a manila envelope. "Arrived at your apartment this morning. I had your mail forwarded here since you're spending so much time at the office." Isabella opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph, professionally taken, showing Vincenzo De Luca standing beside a younger man in a hospital room. The younger man held a newborn baby, and Vincenzo's face, that weathered, dangerous face, was transformed by pure joy. On the back, written in elegant script, "My great-grandson, Javier De Luca, born March 15th. Sofia wanted your father's name to live on in our family. She said it was the only way to properly honor what he gave us. V." The photograph was dated 2 weeks before Vincenzo died. Isabella felt tears burn her eyes. She turned the photo over again, studying Vincenzo's expression in that hospital room. This was the man the world saw as a monster, holding his great-grandson, ensuring that an honest cop's name would be carried forward in a family built on crime and violence. The contradiction was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "There's something else," Marco said quietly. "Sofia De Luca wants to meet with you. She's in town this week, staying at the Four Seasons. She said it's important." They met for lunch at a restaurant far from Bellanote, which had been sold months earlier to a restaurateur with no mob connections. Sofia De Luca was elegant in a navy dress and pearls, her dark hair streaked with distinguished gray. She looked like what she was, a successful physician with a beautiful family and a complicated past. "Thank you for coming," Sofia said, as they settled into a quiet corner booth. "I know this must be strange for you." "Strange seems to be my normal now," Isabella replied with a slight smile. Sofia ordered wine for both of them, then spent several minutes in small talk, asking about the book, about Isabella's teaching position, about her adjustment back to Chicago. But Isabella could see the tension in the other woman's shoulders, the careful way she chose her words. Finally, Sofia reached into her purse and pulled out a leather journal. Worn and clearly well used, she placed it on the table between them. "My father kept this for the last 15 years of his life. It's not what you'd expect. After your father saved me, after he saw that your father was different from other cops, he started writing. Reflections on honor, on the choices he made, on the life he led. He never showed it to anyone, but he left instructions that if anything happened to him, I should give it to you." Isabella stared at the journal as if it might bite. "Why me?" "Because you're the only person who would understand," Sofia said softly. "You're the only person who saw my father as more than just a monster, or just a tragic figure. You saw the complexity, and he wanted you to know his truth, all of it, so you could tell it properly in your book." Isabella's hands trembled as she reached for the journal. The leather was soft, expensive, the pages filled with Vincenzo's elegant handwriting. She opened it randomly and began to read. "Today I visited Javier's grave again. 12 years, and the guilt has not diminished. I dream sometimes that I arrived 5 minutes earlier, that my men got there in time, that I could have saved him the way he saved Sofia. In my dreams, I make different choices. But we don't get to remake the past, only live with its weight. Isabella came to see me today. She has her father's eyes. That same burning need for truth. I am helping her destroy men who deserve destruction. But I wonder if she understands what it costs to become what you must become to fight monsters. I wonder if her father would forgive me for involving her in this darkness. But she would have found her way here regardless. Some people are destined to seek justice, no matter the price. Isabella looked up, tears streaming down her face. He carried so much. We all do, Sophia said gently. That's what your father's death taught us. That every choice has weight. That honor isn't about being perfect, but about trying to do right, even when it costs you everything. My father was a criminal, Isabella. He did terrible things. But he also loved deeply, protected fiercely, and honored his debts. He was complicated, like all of us, and he wanted you to know that. May I keep this? To read fully? It's yours. He left it for you. But Isabella, Sophia hesitated, be careful how you use it. There are things in there that could hurt people who are still alive, innocent people connected to my father's organization. He trusted you to be wise about what truths need to be told, and which ones can stay buried. Isabella nodded slowly, understanding the responsibility being placed on her shoulders. This journal could be dynamite, revealing operations, naming names, exposing secrets that powerful people had paid to keep hidden. But it also contained the private thoughts of a dying man trying to make sense of his life, trying to find redemption for sins that couldn't be washed away. I'll be careful, she promised. I'll honor what needs to be honored and protect what needs to be protected. Sophia smiled with relief. That's all my father asked. That's all any of us can ask. They spent the rest of lunch talking about lighter things, Sophia's children, Isabella's students, the small joys of ordinary life. But as they prepared to leave, Sophia reached across the table and grasped Isabella's hand. Thank you, she said intensely, for seeing my father as a person, for not reducing him to just the crimes he committed, or just the good he tried to do at the end. The world needs complex stories, not simple ones. And you're the only one who can tell this story right. That evening, Isabella sat in her apartment with the journal, a glass of wine, and her laptop. She read through Vincenzo's entries chronologically, watching his thoughts evolve from the practical concerns of running a criminal empire to deeper philosophical questions about morality, legacy, and redemption. One entry, dated just a month before his death, stopped her cold. The doctors say I have perhaps 6 months. The cancer is aggressive, and I am too old for aggressive treatments. I find myself at peace with this. I have lived longer than most men in my profession, and I got to see Sophia build a good life, got to meet my great-grandson. But what troubles me is what comes after. I am not a religious man, though I was raised Catholic. I don't know if there is a God waiting to judge me, or if there is only silence. But if there is a God, and if there is a heaven, I wonder if Javier Marquez is there. I wonder if he would shake my hand or turn away. I hope, and this is a foolish hope, I know, that he might understand that I tried, that I failed him when it mattered most, but I never stopped trying to make it right, that I protected his daughter as I would have protected Sophia, that I honored his memory every day by being slightly better than I was before I met him. Perhaps that is all redemption is, becoming incrementally less terrible until the sum total of our tiny improvements outweighs some small portion of our sins. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is all I have to offer. Isabella closed the journal and cried. For her father, for Vincenzo, for Sophia, for all the people caught in the crossfire of violence and corruption. But she also cried with a strange sense of hope. Because if Vincenzo De Luca, the most feared crime lord in Chicago, could seek redemption and honor his debts with such dedication, then perhaps there was hope for all of them. Her book would tell this story. All of it. The good and the bad, the heroism and the failure, the complexity and the contradiction. She would show the world that justice was messy, that redemption was possible even for the worst among us, and that sometimes the people we least expect become the ones who save us. 3 weeks later, on a bright May morning, Isabella returned to Oakwood Cemetery. It was not the anniversary of her father's death, not any special date, just a random Tuesday when she felt the need to visit. She brought both yellow roses and white lilies, placing them together on her father's grave. The marble headstone gleamed in the sunlight, freshly cleaned by cemetery staff. Someone, probably Sophia, had arranged for perpetual care, ensuring that Detective Javier Marquez's final resting place would always be maintained. "I finished the book, Dad," Isabella said softly, sitting on the grass beside the grave. "It tells your story, and Vincenzo's story, and mine. It tells the truth about what you sacrificed and what you saved. People are going to read it, and some will call you a hero, and some will say you crossed lines you shouldn't have crossed. But they'll all know that you tried to do right, even when doing right meant making deals with devils." She paused, touching the cool marble. "I think I understand now why you did it. Why you risked everything to save Sophia. Because she was 17 and innocent, and none of what her father did was her fault. Because the badge on your chest didn't just mean enforcing laws. It meant protecting people, all people, even the daughters of crime lords. You saw a girl who needed saving and you didn't hesitate. That's who you were." A breeze rustled through the oak tree above, causing shadows to dance across the grass. Isabella looked up at the branches, now full with spring leaves, and smiled. "Vincenzo died believing you would understand what he tried to do for me. Believing that maybe, somewhere, you two could finally have that conversation you never got to finish. I don't know if heaven works that way, Dad, but I hope it does. I hope you two are sitting somewhere having coffee, arguing about ethics and honor and all the complicated things that you both believed in. And I hope you've forgiven him for being 5 minutes too late, because he never forgave himself." Isabella stood, brushing grass from her jeans. Before she left, she pulled out one final item from her bag, a small framed photograph she had commissioned. It showed her father in his dress uniform on one side and Vincenzo in his finest suit on the other, with a quote between them that she had written herself. "Two men, divided by law, united by honor. May they both rest in peace, knowing that their daughters remember not just what they were, but what they tried to be." She placed it carefully at the base of the headstone, where it would weather over time, but endure. Then she walked away from the cemetery, carrying Vincenzo's journal under her arm and her father's legacy in her heart. The book would publish in 3 weeks. The world would judge her father, would judge Vincenzo, would judge her for telling their story. But Isabella no longer cared about judgment. She had learned that truth was more important than perception, that complexity was more honest than simplicity, and that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come from the most flawed among us. She had found justice for her father. She had helped redeem a dying crime lord. And she had learned that legacy isn't about being perfect. It's about trying to be better, every single day, until the sum of those attempts adds up to something that matters. As she drove away from the cemetery, the sun broke through the clouds, flooding the city in golden light. Chicago stretched before her, scarred and beautiful, corrupt and hopeful, a place where detectives made deals with crime lords and where both could somehow, impossibly, be right. Isabella smiled, turned on the radio, and drove toward her future, carrying the weight of the past, but no longer crushed by it. The flowers on her father's grave would wilt and be replaced, season after season, year after year. But the story they represented, of honor, sacrifice, redemption, and love, would endure far longer than marble or memory. And that, Isabella finally understood, was all anyone could hope for. To be remembered not as perfect, but as human. Not as hero or villain, but as someone who tried, who failed, who tried again, and who left the world slightly better than they found it. It was enough. It had to be enough. And in the end, it was everything.